welcome to Blackman Folktales. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also like and share. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, as this means the whole world to us. The billionaire who trusted the wrong woman. The city had a way of whispering Adrian Cole's name through the glow of its skyscrapers and the restless pulse of its streets. To some, he was a genius, a visionary who had defied the chains of poverty to ascend into the rarefied world of billionaires. To others, he was a ruthless conqueror who treated business like a battlefield, winning wars with cold precision and crushing those who dared oppose him. Adrian was all of those things, and yet none of them captured the loneliness that shadowed him. He sat that night in the penthouse of his glass tower, a man draped in Italian silk and guarded by walls of fortune, but stripped of something far more valuable. The world believed he had everything. His photograph graced financial magazines, his name trended in news cycles, and his wealth was enough to make governments bend. But when the cameras turned away, when the phone stopped ringing, and when the city below him dissolved into silence, Adrian felt the same aching emptiness he had known as a boy staring at a cracked ceiling in a one-room apartment. The truth was this: no matter how much gold he stacked around himself, Adrian Cole remained a man whose heart had been carved hollow by the sacrifices he made to climb to the top. The price of power was not measured in money, it was measured in isolation. He had locked away every ounce of vulnerability, every dream of love, every tender impulse, behind the same iron gates that guarded his empire. And for years it worked. Nothing touched him, nothing weakened him, nothing human dared creep through the cracks he refused to show. Yet, in the quiet of that penthouse, Adrian's thoughts wandered to the ghosts of his past. The boy who used to run barefoot in the dusty streets of his neighborhood, the mother who had given her last meal so he could eat, the father who had vanished when life grew too hard. Those memories were not ornaments to him. They were scars, etched deep, reminding him of where he had come from. They were the engine that fueled his relentless drive, but they were also the chains that bound his soul. He had promised himself long ago that he would never again be powerless, never again depend on anyone, never again risk the pain of abandonment. And he had kept that promise with ruthless devotion. But what he did not realize, what he refused to admit, was that in shielding himself from weakness, he had also built a prison. Adrian had become untouchable, yes, but in the process, he had made himself unreachable. His empire glittered, but his heart gathered dust in the dark. Nights like these, as he stared out over the city lights, he would wonder if there was someone out there who could see through the armor, who could love the man instead of the myth. And then, almost angrily, he would shake the thought away, burying it beneath deals, strategies, and acquisitions. Love was a distraction, he told himself, a liability, and yet, in the deepest corners of his being, he craved it more than anything his billions could buy. The irony of Adrian Cole's life was that the same qualities that made him a legend in the corporate world made him a ghost in his private one. He was disciplined, sharp, and calculating, a man who trusted no one, because to trust was to bleed. His relationships had been transactional at best. Models who adored his wealth, partners who admired his power, acquaintances who flattered him for favors. But never, never had he found someone who truly saw him. And so he lived behind glass, watching life pass as though it were a movie he couldn't touch. People envied his fortune, but no one envied the solitude that weighed on his chest each night. What the world didn't know, what even Adrian sometimes tried to deny, was that beneath his flawless suits and iron confidence, he was desperately human. He wanted to laugh without suspicion. He wanted to hold someone without wondering if they were counting the zeros in his account. He wanted to be loved, not as Adrian Cole the billionaire, but as Adrian Cole the man. And yet, he had convinced himself such a thing did not exist. He had armored himself too well, convinced the universe had not written that kind of chapter for him. But life, with its cruel humor, has a way of shattering walls when least expected. And on the horizon of Adrian's carefully constructed empire was a storm he could neither predict nor control, the arrival of a woman who would make him believe again, only to break him in ways that even the fiercest competitors never could. She was coming, and with her, she carried both the warmth he longed for and the poison that would nearly destroy him. Adrian Cole did not believe in fate. He believed in numbers, strategy, and the iron law of cause and effect. But that evening, as he stepped out of his sleek black limousine into the golden glow of the Metropolitan Art Gallery, something shifted. The gala was one of those carefully orchestrated social rituals where money and influence mingled beneath chandeliers, where paintings became excuses for whispered negotiations, and where every smile hid an agenda. Adrian attended out of obligation, not desire. He despised the shallowness of it all, the way people clung to him like moths desperate for a spark of his fire. Yet, somewhere between the swirl of champagne glasses and the artificial laughter, his eyes landed on her. Serena. She stood at the far end of the hall, not chasing attention, not orbiting anyone important, but quietly admiring a painting of a storm-tossed sea. She was striking, yes, but not in the predictable way of models and socialites who paraded their beauty like trophies. There was something understated about her. Her black dress was elegant without screaming for notice, her posture relaxed, but somehow regal. And it was the expression in her eyes that disarmed him most. They carried the weight of someone who understood storms, who had weathered them, and who knew how to pretend they hadn't left scars. Against his will, Adrian felt a tug. In a room full of people clawing for his attention, she was the only one who hadn't even noticed him. And that made her irresistible. Their first conversation was accidental, or at least it appeared so. Adrian had drifted toward the painting she admired, more curious about her than the art. "You like this piece?" he asked, his voice calm, almost detached, the way it always was when addressing strangers. Serena glanced at him, briefly, before returning her gaze to the canvas. "It's not about liking it," she replied softly. "It's about understanding it. The sea doesn't apologize for being violent. It just is." Adrian was stunned. He was used to small talk, empty chatter about market trends, vacations, and compliments about his wealth. But here was a woman who spoke of storms as though she carried them inside her. They lingered there, talking not about money or fame, but about resilience, loneliness, and the strange ways people mask their pain. Adrian, a man who had mastered the art of emotional silence, found himself speaking freely, almost carelessly, to this stranger. And as the night stretched on, he realized he hadn't once checked his phone, hadn't thought about the stock market or tomorrow's deals. For the first time in years, he was present, immersed in something real, or at least what felt real. When she finally excused herself, Adrian was left staring after her, a man who had suddenly remembered what it meant to feel alive. But what Adrian didn't know, and what Serena never allowed to show, was that their meeting had been no accident. From the moment he walked into that gallery, he had been her target. She knew his patterns, his routines, his habits. The painting she stood by had been carefully chosen, her dress calculated to disarm rather than intimidate, her words rehearsed, yet delivered with the perfect illusion of spontaneity. To Adrian, Serena was a rare soul who understood the storms of life. In truth, she was a storm herself, one crafted by forces beyond him, one designed to infiltrate his walls and tear them down from within. Yet, in that moment, none of that mattered to Adrian Cole. He had met a woman who didn't worship his wealth, who didn't bow to his name, and who made him forget the loneliness he carried like a shadow. And, though he didn't know it yet, the course of his life, his empire, his heart, and his very soul, had just begun to tilt in a direction that would leave him unrecognizable when the storm was done. Days turned into weeks, and Serena slipped seamlessly into Adrian's life, like she had always belonged there. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, or so he thought. While others flaunted designer brands and boasted of their connections, Serena was understated, elegant, and grounded. She never asked about his fortune. She teased him instead, mocking his obsession with schedules and his inability to relax. When they dined, she chose small, quiet restaurants tucked away in corners of the city rather than the glittering establishments reserved for celebrities and moguls. Adrian was captivated by the simplicity she brought into his otherwise calculated world. With Serena, he wasn't Adrian Cole, the billionaire. He was just Adrian, a man allowed to laugh, to listen, to feel. And as she wove herself deeper into his daily life, Adrian began to experience something dangerously foreign to him: trust. He introduced her to his private world, showing her pieces of his childhood he had never revealed to anyone else. She listened with eyes that shimmered with empathy, nodding at the right moments, reaching for his hand when his voice faltered. Adrian, who had sworn never to need anyone, began to wonder if perhaps he had finally found the exception. But Serena's charm was no accident. It was a web. Each move was deliberate, each gesture carefully designed to lower his defenses. She played her part with chilling perfection, embodying the balance of vulnerability and strength that Adrian longed for. She allowed him glimpses of her struggles, Tales of a difficult childhood, of betrayal, of financial hardship, each story crafted to mirror his own scars. She cried when he confided in her, not because she felt his pain, but because she knew that tears would bind him to her. She laughed at his rare attempts at humor, not because they amused her, but because she knew Adrian had forgotten what it felt like to be truly heard. Every sigh, every pause, every word that escaped her lips was another thread in the web she spun around him. And Adrian, blinded by the very thing he had long craved, connection, walked willingly into her trap, never once questioning why her storms so perfectly aligned with his. In the boardroom, Adrian remained the formidable figure he had always been, but outside of it, he began to soften. His closest associates noticed the change. The guarded man who once kept even his partners at a distance now smiled more, seemed distracted, even vulnerable. Some admired this transformation, believing Adrian had finally found balance. Others whispered warnings, uneasy at how quickly Serena had claimed a place at his side. But Adrian dismissed them all. For once, he was not negotiating deals or calculating risks. He was surrendering, allowing himself to feel the sweetness of intimacy. He began to picture a future with Serena, one not defined by contracts or empires, but by love. What he didn't realize, however, was that while he envisioned a life with her, she envisioned something entirely different. To her, Adrian was not a man to love. He was a fortress to conquer, a treasure chest to unlock, and a target to dismantle from within. And though the storm had not yet broken, its winds were already gathering, and Adrian was standing in the very center without even knowing it. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the faint rattle of a window before a hurricane. A confidential proposal leaked to a rival company days before Adrian was set to present it. A trusted investor pulled out of a major deal without warning, citing concerns that seemed too specific to be coincidence. An internal project stalled because someone had tampered with critical documents. Adrian, ever the strategist, chalked it up to bad luck, market volatility, or the inevitable challenges of running a vast empire. But luck didn't usually strike the same place twice, and as the disruptions multiplied, a quiet unease began to gnaw at him. Still, whenever suspicion flared, Serena was there, her presence soothing him, her words convincing him that everything would be fine. She became his anchor, his comfort, the one who whispered calm into his storm. And so, Adrian did what he had promised himself never to do. He leaned on her completely, unaware that the very storm tearing into his empire was the same woman holding him in her arms. The cracks widened quickly. Adrian found himself distracted in meetings, his mind wandering to Serena instead of strategies. Decisions that once came to him with razor-sharp clarity now blurred, clouded by his desire to spend more time in her presence. He began delegating responsibilities he normally would have handled personally, trusting others in ways he never had before. And while he drifted further into Serena's embrace, the empire he had built with blood and sacrifice began to falter. Partners who had once sworn loyalty turned their backs. Deals collapsed before his eyes, and whispers of instability swirled in boardrooms. Adrian, oblivious to the carefully orchestrated sabotage around him, saw only one truth: that life had finally given him love. And so, even as the foundations of his kingdom trembled, he clung to Serena, believing she was the only steady thing in a world suddenly shifting beneath his feet. But behind the scenes, Serena's mask was beginning to slip, not in ways obvious to Adrian, but in subtle cracks only the careful observer could see. There were late-night phone calls she claimed were from an old friend. There were unexplained absences, brushed off with excuses that felt just plausible enough. There were moments when her eyes darkened, when her touch felt colder, when her silence lingered longer than it should have. Adrian noticed, but he silenced his instincts, telling himself that doubt was the enemy of love. He wanted so badly to believe in her, to believe that this woman was the answer to the loneliness that had defined his life, that he ignored the warning signs glowing like fire in the dark. And so he remained blind, clinging to a love that was already curdling into betrayal. What Adrian didn't know was that the cracks he saw in his empire were not accidents. They were the first blows of a carefully executed plan, a plan Serena had been weaving from the very moment she smiled at him across that painting of a storm-tossed sea. The hurricane was no longer distant. It was here, and Adrian Cole, the untouchable billionaire, was about to discover just how fragile his world truly was. Adrian Cole had always trusted his instincts, the razor-sharp intuition that had guided him from a penniless boy to a man whose empire stretched across continents. But lately, those instincts were conflicted, gnawing at him in ways he didn't fully understand. Serena was everything he thought he wanted. Charming, tender, empathetic, and yet cracks had begun to show in her carefully polished image. It started with the little things. She had once told him her parents lived abroad, estranged from her since her teenage years. Yet one evening, he overheard her on the phone whispering furiously to someone she referred to as Mama. Another time, Adrian returned home earlier than expected from a business trip to find her hastily shoving a document into her purse. When questioned, she claimed it was a list of errands, though her face betrayed the flicker of panic that set his heart on edge. Even her scent had changed. He noticed a cologne on her that wasn't hers, faint but sharp, as though she had been too close to someone else. Adrian's mind told him to investigate, to dig deeper, but his heart rebelled. For so long he had longed for this companionship, tenderness, the illusion of love, and he wasn't ready to believe it was all a facade. Instead, he swallowed his doubts, convincing himself he was paranoid, that the burden of his collapsing empire was making him suspicious of the one person who stood by him. But the signs became harder to ignore. At dinners, Serena often slipped away to take calls, her explanations vague, her eyes distant when she returned. Once, Adrian followed her discreetly into the hallway during one of these calls and caught the tail end of her conversation, her voice low, urgent, laced with fear. When she saw him standing there, she forced a smile and claimed it was a friend struggling through a breakup. Adrian wanted to believe her, but the unease gnawed deeper. Then there were the meetings. Adrian was startled one day when his fiercest rival, Marcus Hale, casually mentioned details about Adrian's latest acquisition that not even his board knew. It was a dagger to the heart, though Marcus framed it as a careless slip of information picked up through the grapevine. Adrian left that meeting with a cold sweat dripping down his spine, haunted by a single question. How had Marcus known? That night, as he stared at Serena across the dinner table, he couldn't shake the thought that her eyes seemed almost calculating. There was a sharpness in her gaze that didn't match the softness of her voice. And when she reached for his hand, he felt a chill instead of comfort. For the first time, Adrian allowed the possibility to creep into his mind. What if the woman he loved was the very knife pressed against his throat? Still, Adrian hesitated. His entire life had been built on skepticism, on questioning motives, on never letting anyone too close. But with Serena, he had chosen to be different. He had chosen to let his walls fall, to believe in the idea of love, to embrace vulnerability. And now, if Serena was truly betraying him, it wasn't just his fortune at stake. It was his very faith in humanity, his ability to ever trust again. So he did what lonely men in love often do. He ignored the sirens screaming in his soul and doubled down on his devotion. He bought Serena a necklace, a piece so rare it drew envy even in elite circles, as though to remind himself that love, not suspicion, was what defined them. But as he clasped it around her neck, watching her smile in the mirror, he couldn't shake the flicker of darkness in her eyes, a darkness that suggested the gift wasn't a symbol of love, but a trophy she had already won. Adrian Cole had built an empire by spotting threats before they struck, but when it came to Serena, he was willfully blind. And that blindness was the crack through which destruction would pour. The revelation didn't come gently. It crashed into Adrian's world like a wrecking ball, leaving nothing but dust and disbelief. It began with an emergency board meeting, one Adrian hadn't even called. When he arrived, his top executives sat grim-faced, folders spread across the table. Within them were documents, bank transfers, emails, evidence of a leak so catastrophic it had crippled one of their largest holdings. Billions had evaporated overnight, and worse, the trail of betrayal led back to someone with access to his most intimate accounts. Adrian's stomach clenched as he scanned the files, his eyes widening at the familiar signature on a transfer authorization. Serena, his Serena, the woman he had kissed, held, trusted. Her name was etched on documents that bled his empire dry. For a moment, Adrian couldn't breathe. He sat there frozen, staring at the black ink as though it were poison seeping into his veins. His board members watched in silence, some with pity, others with disgust. But Adrian barely noticed. His mind was a hurricane of denial and dawning realization. He wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that it was forged, that Serena would never, could never betray him. But in his heart, he knew. Every doubt, every inconsistency, every late-night call and whispered lie came crashing together into a picture so clear it made him sick. He left the meeting without a word, his body numb as he returned to his penthouse. There she was, waiting for him, draped in the necklace he had gifted her only days before. She smiled, but this time he saw it differently, not as warmth, but as performance, a mask stretched across her face. Adrian's voice shook when he asked her about the documents, about the transfers, about Marcus Hale. For a heartbeat, Serena's mask faltered. Her eyes hardened, her lips tightened, and in that silence, Adrian saw the truth he had been running from. She didn't bother denying it. Instead, she spoke with chilling calm, admitting what he already knew. She had been sent into his life, planted like a seed by those who sought his downfall. Marcus had orchestrated it, yes, but Serena had played her role with precision, weaving herself into Adrian's trust until she had access to everything he swore he'd never surrender. And then, as though twisting the knife, she admitted that parts of it had been easy, not because Adrian was weak, but because he had been so desperately human, so hungry for love, that he had handed her the very keys to his destruction. Adrian's world collapsed in that moment, not because of the money, not even because of the empire crumbling around him, but because the one person he thought had seen him, the man, not the billionaire, had never truly existed to her. Every laugh, every touch, every whispered promise had been a weapon disguised as affection. The betrayal was more than financial. It was personal, a shattering of the fragile hope he had allowed himself to feel. He staggered back, staring at the woman he once imagined as his future, and felt an emptiness deeper than any he had known in his childhood poverty. Adrian Cole, the man who had been untouchable, was finally broken. His empire was in ruins, his heart in shards, and the truth lay before him like a corpse. He had trusted the wrong woman, and in doing so, had lost not just his fortune, but a part of his soul. Yet, even in that devastation, a seed of something new began to stir. Not love, not hope, but something darker. Pain was transforming into resolve, betrayal into a thirst for reckoning. Adrian Cole was down, but he was not finished. Serena had underestimated the man she betrayed, and that mistake would cost her more than she could ever imagine. The silence in Adrian Cole's penthouse was suffocating, the kind of silence that does not come from peace, but from devastation. The lavish glass walls that once offered him a panoramic view of the city now felt like transparent prison bars mocking him. Just days earlier, he had stood in this same place, believing he had conquered loneliness, believing he had found the one soul who could see the man beneath the billions. But now, Serena's betrayal had torn that illusion apart with a cruelty that pierced deeper than any corporate rival ever could. His hands trembled as he picked up the documents his private investigator had left him. The forged contracts, the false signatures, the hidden accounts that traced Serena's hand in the embezzlement. Each page was a knife, each detail a confirmation that the woman he had trusted, the woman he had led into his fortress, was nothing more than a predator cloaked in beauty and feigned vulnerability. The reality hit him like a physical blow. The man who had outsmarted governments, beaten billion-dollar corporations, and survived hostile takeovers had been undone by love. Adrian, the untouchable billionaire, was now bleeding where no one could see. The irony was brutal and unforgiving. But it wasn't just the financial betrayal that broke him. It was the intimacy of it, the way Serena had studied his every weakness, the way she had whispered comfort into his loneliness, the way she had touched his scars not to heal them, but to map them for exploitation. Adrian had always thought betrayal would come from boardrooms, from competitors, from men in suits who thirsted for his empire. But no, it had come from soft lips, warm embraces, and the tender laugh of a woman who had convinced him she was different. That night, as he paced the length of his penthouse, he felt rage boil inside him, a fury so consuming it threatened to swallow his very identity. But beneath the rage, there was something far worse: despair. For the first time in years, Adrian felt small again, powerless, like the boy he once was watching his father walk away from the family. The ghost of abandonment had returned, this time wearing Serena's face. He hated her, yet he could not erase the memory of her touch, the way she had made him feel human again. Love and hatred twisted together inside him like venomous serpents, leaving him unable to breathe. And yet, Adrian Cole was not a man who stayed broken. Somewhere in the storm of rage and grief, A resolve began to take shape. He knew he could not undo what had been done, but he could make sure the woman who had dared to play him paid dearly for her deception. The Adrian who once sought love was dead, but the Adrian who had built empires out of nothing was very much alive. As he stared into the cityscape that glittered like a mocking audience, his reflection in the glass looked different, harder, colder, unrecognizable. If Serena wanted to see the real man beneath the billions, then she would. Not the vulnerable one, not the one who dreamed of love, but the one who carved his fortune out of betrayal and fire. This was no longer about love or loneliness. This was war, and Adrian Cole was a man who never lost wars. The confrontation was inevitable, and when it came, it was nothing short of cinematic. Adrian chose the battlefield carefully, not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom, but in the very place where Serena had thought she had conquered him, his penthouse. She entered with the same elegance that had once disarmed him, her beauty still flawless, her voice still honeyed with charm. But Adrian no longer saw the woman he once adored. He saw the mask, and he saw through it. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension as Serena tried to feign innocence, her eyes wide, her words dripping with denial. But Adrian had prepared meticulously. Every detail, every lie, every stolen dollar was documented and laid bare before her. He watched her composure falter, watched the cracks appear in her performance as the walls of deception closed in. For the first time, it was Serena who was cornered and Adrian who held the power. The man she thought she had broken was now staring at her with the eyes of a predator, and there was no softness left in them. Yet, as much as Adrian wanted to destroy her, a part of him hesitated. He had dreamt of this moment, of seeing her crumble under the weight of her lies, of taking everything back from her with the same precision she had used to steal it. And still, when she looked at him, he saw flickers of the woman he had once believed in. He heard the echo of her laughter, remembered the nights when her presence had softened the steel around his heart. It was a cruel paradox. He wanted her to suffer, but he also wanted her to be the woman he had once trusted. The duality tore at him, making every word he spoke heavy with venom and sorrow. Serena, sensing his conflict, tried to manipulate it, her tears flowing, her voice trembling with fabricated remorse. But Adrian had seen too much, felt too much, to fall again. He realized then that this was not just about punishing Serena, it was about reclaiming himself. He could not let her win, not because of the money, but because if he did, he would lose the last shred of the man he had fought so hard to become. And so, Adrian made his final move. He didn't lash out in fury, didn't scream or strike, because true power did not need theatrics. Instead, he executed his plan with the same cold brilliance that had built his empire. Serena's accounts were frozen, her allies exposed, her reputation dismantled. In one calculated sweep, Adrian erased everything she had gained from her betrayal. But more than that, he looked her in the eye and told her the truth that would haunt her far longer than financial ruin. "You never broke me," he said quietly. "You only reminded me of who I am." Those words stripped Serena of her victory, leaving her not as a conqueror, but as a failure who had underestimated her prey. As she walked away, defeated and hollow, Adrian turned back to the city. The storm had passed, but the scars remained. He was still the billionaire, still untouchable, but forever changed. He had trusted the wrong woman and paid the price. Yet, from the ashes of betrayal, Adrian Cole had risen sharper, harder, and more dangerous than ever before. The man who once longed for love now trusted no one, and perhaps that was his truest power of all. Thank you for watching Blackman Stories. Click the subscribe button for more videos.